the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
The views and opinions expressed by A Little Bit Culty are those of the hosts and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast.
That's true.
Any of the fire content provided by our guests, bloggers, sponsors, or authors are of their opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything.
Unless you're abusing people, then I have a problem maligning you.
Also, we're not doctors, psychologists, or wizards. We're just two non-experts trying to make you a friendly, informative podcast that helps you understand culty shit. Hey everybody, Sarah Edmondson here.
And I'm Anthony Ames, a.k.a. Nippy, Sarah's husband, and you're listening to
A Little Bit Culty,
a.k.a. ALBC, a podcast about what happens when devotion goes to the dark side.
We've been there and back again. A little about us. True story, we met and fell in love in a cult. And then we woke up and got the hell out of Dodge.
And the whole thing was captured in the HBO docuseries The Vow, now in its second season.
I also wrote about our experience in my memoir, Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life.
Look at us, a couple of married podcasters who just happen to have a weekly date night where we interview experts and advocates in things like cult awareness and mind control.
Wait. This does not count toward date night, babe. We got to schedule that. That's separate.
So it's 2 days we got to hang out?
We do this podcast thing because we learned a lot on our exit ramp out of NXIVM, still on that journey, and we want to pay the lessons forward with the help of other cult survivors and whistleblowers.
We know all too well that culty things happen. It happens to people every day across every walk of life. So join us each week to tackle these culty dynamics, everywhere from online dating to mega churches and multi-level marketing.
This stuff really is everywhere. The cultiverse just keeps on expanding, and so are we. Welcome to Season 5 of A Little Bit Culty, serving cult content and word salads weekly on your favorite podcast platforms. Learn more at alittlebitculty.com.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, hanging on to it, my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know.
Welcome back, everybody, to this week's episode of A Little Bit Culty.
Have we hit 80 yet?
We're like 80 something.
I lose count, Sarah. You know how it is.
It's so hard. It's just so hard. Why? Do you want to have a birthday party or something?
I was going to say, like, the 100th episode, I'll get some confetti and
maybe that
pop
should
some
be
champagne.
what we do our live event in Atlanta. Could be our 100th episode live in ATL.
There you go. Cocktails.
Okay. Cocktail hour.
LBC cocktails. A little bit cocktails.
With Sarah and Nippy. Just trying to make that sweet, sweet lemonade. Actually, all the cocktails should be lemons-based. You know what I mean?
I see what you're doing there.
Yeah, it's the lemonade that we made.
Yeah.
Lemonade is actually, check out this segue.
Oh, I was going to say, dude, I was like, I saw the wheels turning on that one. That was
when
segue
I find
Sarah.
a good segue, it just really makes me happy.
Yeah.
But truthfully, it's true. A terrible experience can be turned into a beautiful story. It doesn't make it worth it, but sometimes it helps. And our guest today is an example of that. Daniel Barban Levin is the author of a 2021 memoir called, and I got it wrong last week, so for all the people who want to write me and tell me I got it wrong, I know I got it wrong. I'm fixing it now. Slonim Woods 9. I missed the Woods part. Slonim Woods 9 is an incredible book. I actually listened to it on Audible. It tackles Daniel's experience getting into, surviving, and escaping an abusive cult while in college. You can check out this book in our show notes.
Still marveling at the segue.
Thank you.
Segue history right there. Anyway, specifically, he's talking about the story of Larry Ray, a dad who moved into his daughter's college dorm and started a sex-centered cult. Slonim Woods 9 is the actual dorm room where it all started.
If you're unfamiliar with the story, here it is in a nutshell. And note, our episode today mostly focuses on Daniel's healing journey. And if you want to understand what happened within the cult, we highly recommend the doc on Hulu called Stolen Youth. And we think it was a very well-made documentary. This particular story, like we said, is more focused on Daniel. Next week, we'll be interviewing Zach Heinzerling, the director. But If you haven't seen the doc yet,
Here are the cliff notes.
yes.
In 2009, Talia Ray showed up to Sarah Lawrence College north of Manhattan, New York, and began telling her group of newly found college friends about how great her father was. As she explained it, her dad, Larry Ray, was waiting to get out of jail on false charges.
And specifically, there was stories about his work with Gorbachev, his work with the police force, with his work with all these high-level people in various fields. And by the time he showed up on college campus, he was being touted as this great man who was the victim of a conspiracy theory. And this is where a lot of people are like, wait, how is this grown man allowed to stay in the dorm room? And we're going to answer those questions.
Well, he had been edified.
He'd been edified, and I guess the university was not super involved with these sort of off-campus dorms. Or I'm not sure if it's off-campus or adjacent to campus, but
Which is kind of common.
It's common, I guess, but we're going to get into that, and trust me, we all wanted to know. In 2010, when Larry finally did get out of jail, he moved in with his daughter in student housing, initially playing the role of caretaker to Talia and her housemates. He would clean up for them, he would cook them elaborate meals, he would give them advice. He was like this cool older dad who was going to help them.
One night, he called a meeting and began a presentation on a philosophy he'd stolen called, quote, Quest for Potential.
Sound familiar?
Essentially, he told his daughter's housemates that there was a better version of themselves deep down within them and that he could unblock whatever traumas or obstacles were lying in the way.
Again, sound familiar? This manifested into Ray having an enormous amount of control over these kids, unleashing domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking eventually, and also financial abuse.
This lasted an entire decade, during which his victims reportedly surrendered $1 million in cash to Ray, as well as sexual favors. Many were seriously beaten and physically harmed.
Larry was sentenced to 60 years in prison for human trafficking, as we reported a few weeks ago, on January 20th.
The Hulu documentary Stolen Youth is a tough but important watch that covers the Sarah Lawrence-based cult.
Daniel, our subject today, currently lives in Los Angeles and is a teacher, helping his students transform their most difficult memories into compelling writing.
He holds an MFA in poetry from the University of California, Irvine. He has won several poetry awards, and his writing has been featured in Bat City Review, the Sarah Lawrence Review, The Offbeat, and many, many other publications.
On today's episode, Levin gets into toxic masculinity and how it intersects with how men treat themselves and their bodies. And as a writer, he also gets into the meaning of the word cult, especially how it intersects with domestic abuse and masculinity. Please note, major trigger warning, especially with the documentary. There's some very violent graphic images. We don't get too much into that here. Again, we recommend the doc, we recommend Daniel's book, and all of it covers domestic, sexual, financial abuse, and also coercive control. Without further ado,
Daniel Levin.
Daniel Levin, welcome to A Little Bit Culty. And I don't want to love bomb you, but I also want you to know that I really deeply care for you and I loved your book. And I'm going to try really hard not to cry in this episode, but I guarantee you that's not going to happen.
The love bombing is starting.
The
right
love
away,
bombing has
Daniel.
started. And sometimes you can express love and it's not love bombing.
Yeah,
This
It's
is what
okay.
we
No,
learned.
I know.
love without control.
We know this now.
Love without bombing is always good, I think. What a weird term now that I say it out loud.
Yeah. First of all, welcome officially to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's just so great. I don't know if you remember this, but like a year ago when you first connected with Yanya Lalich, I think she tried to connect us, but like you weren't ready. And then there was a trial. But then so I started reading your book and everything. So you've been in like my mind, I think, since the story came public. So for me, I feel like I'm get to reunite with an old friend who doesn't know me. It's just sort of weird.
That's so nice. Yeah, I'm so happy to be
That's
here.
how I feel.
The process of when the story first broke, I mean, I'm sure, as you know, when the story broke and then writing the book and then making the documentary and then navigating the legal side with the trial and the FBI. And it's been a really crazy few years. So I'm so happy to be here now. We're on the other side of Larry having been sentenced a couple weeks ago. So it's an auspicious time.
Hurrah!
You want to start with that, Sarah?
We should have sent some champagne to start this off and been like, let's first toast to Larry Ray being in prison for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
It's going to turn into a little bit culty cocktail hour.
Yeah.
We should have a
That's
cocktail.
really good idea. We should have a cocktail hour.
Make a great cocktail.
Yes.
Daniel, you're going to be on our first cocktail
I
hour.
would love that. I
Oh
mean,
my God.
It is 9 a.m. in LA, but
It's 5 p.m. somewhere. Right?
yeah.
Anyway, listen, I know I messaged you last night because I couldn't wait because I was like on the last few pages of your book and just like tears streaming down my face. Nip, you don't know this. Nip, you went to bed ahead of me like an hour.
I could feel it.
Could you feel me
it.
like weeping? Yeah. I was hoping
I
you'd
could
wake
feel
up
it.
and be like, "Are you okay?" And then like, I just finished Daniel's book and it was so good.
I tucked you in while you were sleeping.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
I want you to know that we're really going to, obviously, we encourage everybody to watch the documentary, which we think is wonderful. And I think your book is like, you know, a fabulous companion piece. And the two together really give such a full scope. And we don't want to go through all the details in this podcast. It's unnecessary because it's all elsewhere, and B, just like for you and your heart and your well-being. And I know how it feels when people are like, "So tell me about the night of the branding." And I'm like, seriously, like Google it. We go in and out of seriousness and also laughter. So you just let us know how you feel with all that. But first of all, how are you doing? Like, how are you right now in all of this?
You know, I'm doing well, and I love the approach that you just described, because one of the things that's really hard about navigating being a survivor of this kind of abuse, but I suspect of any kind of abuse, is like, you know, still being a full human being who experiences the full range of emotions, not just like constantly suffering. So figuring out how to be like, yeah, one of the amazing things about being here now after Larry has been sentenced is like, I can get together with Santos and Felicia and Claudia and Yali, like other survivors, and we laugh not just about life, but at like the things that were so absurd about the experience that we had. Like, of course, you know, all of this couched in this context of abuse, but it was like, you know, there's this like mid-50s, you know, deep New Jersey accent man lumbering around in his like tidy whities, and like, yes, that's horrifying. But you can like take something out of the fear and pain by like laughing at this like clown.
Look, I think that's the best elixir.
That's the best. I'm so glad that you brought up the tidy whities, because that was an image.
Are we going to pick on people with tidy whities again?
No, again, it's not the tidy whities.
I'm just a little defensive of the tidy whities.
You don't even wear tidy whities.
You don't know that.
Yes, I do. We're married.
You do.
It's not the tidy whities. It's the whole gestalt of the thing, you know, and the absurdity. And I'm so happy to hear that you can go into the laughing stage. I think that's so healthy. And I know not everybody's there. Every now and then we get an email from someone being like, you're not taking this seriously enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard line to walk as someone speaking about this, and it's hard to know how to navigate it as a survivor encountering media, you know, around cults, around coercive control, because what I want is to figure out how to kind of take this experience, which made me feel so isolated and so separate from the rest of society. Like it was so hard for me to conceptualize what I was experiencing while I was experiencing it, because it didn't feel like anyone talked about cults that had people who looked like me in them. You know, I'm sure you talk about this over and over, but you know, it's not robes and it's not religious, and at least in my experience, and there's no Kool-Aid and all these things. And you know, not to mention that it's hard enough for anyone being a survivor of sexual assault in any way, but being a man, you know, there weren't many models to look at. So it just was so hard to understand what was happening. And then after I left, it took me a long time to call it a cult at all. And so you sort of enter this world years later where still the discourse is really limited, and it feels like others cult survivors more than it sort of brings them in. And so trying to figure out how to normalize the experience. And I think that being sort of light about it is part of that, being like, this doesn't have to be so scary to talk about, but also figuring out how to take it seriously and respect the pain.
I have about 83 hours of a little bit culty episodes to send you that I think does that. And it's like people write to us all the time, survivors, but then also people who are like, I totally see cults differently now and see how this could have happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what's amazing.
Well, I don't know if it's too early to address, but you know, there is a particular ecosystem, I think that goes on amongst men who are sexually abused than it is for women, simply because there's not a lot of men that are inspired to come out and tell their stories. It hits on a different level for a man to be in that position, I think. And to do it and transcend that, I think would pave the way for a lot of other people and put a language to it, minus the jokes, obviously, but I think that's one of the serious aspects of this. And I love that that's one of the things that you wrote on your job form, because I think it's a conversation to be had.
Yeah, agreed. I think, I grew up in kind of rural New Jersey. My parents are progressive, but it was a really conservative area. And, just I think in our society in general, you're raised, masculinity is really limiting. And there's kind of only one option, it feels like. And you're taught that you're not supposed to care what happens to your body, and any sex is good sex, anything is good. And then Larry comes along, while I was at Sarah Lawrence, which is a much more sort of open-minded environment. I was starting to explore and find out, that there might be different avenues for me to live and express myself as like a person who looks the way I do, like in a man's body, but, with like femininity and with fluidity. And yeah, as great as that exploration is, it's also really scary. And not having answers, as you know, is really scary. We just living in a world without clear answers is so frustrating. And so this guy shows up and is like, I have simple answers for you. You don't have to struggle with all of these worries and fears that I think most young men do, which is like, am I straight or am I gay? Why do I have these feelings where I'm bouncing up against the limitations of what it means to be a man? Is my body okay? I'm not allowed to ask about that or talk about that. Why are relationships so difficult? Who do I talk to about these things? And for someone to just come along and say, you don't have to worry about that because I have all the answers, is unbelievably appealing.
In terms of how you got in, your hook, I really loved how, and this was in the documentary and the book, specifically the way you wrote out the conversation. Because I read your book before I watched the doc. And I remember saying to Nippy, and if you don't remember this, I said, oh my God, listen, like Nippy, this conversation between Daniel and Larry Ray is like word for word us and Keith Raniere. Do you remember? It was like the coaching, transformation, potential, clarity, truth.
Oh, all the buzzwords.
All the buzzwords and the hook of that, and how you described how he helped you. And you used the word later in your book, you were basking in his warmth, in the light of his warmth, or something like that. Your metaphors are amazing, by the way. Daniel's clearly a very accomplished writer. He puts to words things that I've always struggled to articulate in terms of like the inner process of somebody, in this case, getting hooked, right? Like, so when you get hooked, then you have this moment, you realize you've been in the cafe for 6 hours, you walk out, and your friends, all of your friends and roommates are sitting in a limousine waiting for you. And you wrote something about how like there wasn't even an option, like to not get in. Like, of course you're getting in, right?
Right, totally. Yeah.
I love that, how you express that, that hook.
Yeah, that's what I really wanted with the book is, like I said, I felt like part of what Larry did, and what I think a lot of cult leaders do, is create a situation where the circumstances are so absurd. Like, it's not just that they're hurting you, but the things they're doing are so crazy that it feels like you couldn't possibly begin to explain them. So it was all of it. It was from the beginning, the fact that I had gotten to this Starbucks around in the morning, and we sat down and talked, and that because of the way he talked, and try to talk about like that feeling of, when you're waiting for a pause in a conversation so that you can say something, and there's like a natural flow to conversation that we all kind of subtly learn over time, but you're not really conscious of. Larry, just part of his power was not hewing to any social etiquette at all. So I just waited for something to say. And in that Starbucks, I waited essentially for hours, or would only be able to talk when he sort of let me talk. And then in a lot of ways, it felt like I was waiting for a moment to say, hey, I think I need to go, for like years. And that moment almost never came until finally I just realized you have to, in a sort of larger metaphorical sense, like be willing to interrupt, as uncomfortable as that feels. So yeah, I all that time passed in the Starbucks, there's that weird time dilation of not really understanding how you've been talking to someone for that long. You're disoriented already. You've been love bombed. A lot of this was him telling me how special I was, how he could see that I had these qualities that, and it felt like he was sort of ringing that bell inside of me of like, oh, these are things that I've always wanted someone to say, plus getting to open up about all these things I was insecure about and had never, ever talked about. And then we walk out of the Starbucks when he said we were done and around the corner. And it was at that moment that he said, part of why I'm sort of a little all over the place, but part of why I agreed to have that conversation in the first place was my friends at school had been encouraging me to talk to him.
Because they'd been
Because he had
helped.
been helping
Right.
them. Yeah, exactly. And I was going through a breakup, which, makes you vulnerable. And it was a long, drawn out breakup. And it wasn't clear to me what I should do. And then on top of that, it was the summer in the middle of college. Sarah Lawrence is right outside New York City. Everyone seemed to live in the city, and I didn't understand how they could afford it. And, what I didn't get is that everyone has like parents who are supplementing their income, which I didn't. So all these things together, they were like, talk to Larry. He'll help you because you seem like you're struggling. He'll help you figure out the situation with your relationship. And maybe, you can crash on his couch or something, or he'll, he's very generous. And so it's like, fine, what harm can a coffee do? And then, however, like conservatively 6 hours later, I'm walking around the corner with him. He at that point is like, also, you just end your relationship. Just, don't answer phone calls, don't answer texts. You can be done. And there was a stretch limousine waiting on the corner, and the door opened, and all of my friends were inside, and they had been waiting that whole 6 hours. And of course, what was I going to do? Not get in? And that's was the whole thing. Like, it would be weird for me to not do what he said.
Yeah, the love bombing and the glamour, making it kind of clever, glamorous. Also, he love bombed
clever.
with steak, which would totally be my weak spot, right? Like if somebody came over and cooked me steak on the
Yeah,
regular, I'd be
steak
like,
and wine.
what do I got to do next?
Yeah, he was a good cook. Yeah.
So many great details here in terms of your slow foray into being more and more enthralled, which I think was a word that your dad used in the documentary, that you were under his thrall. Knowing what you know now with all your cult research and education, what were some of the red flags that you couldn't see because you didn't know what you were looking at?
From the beginning, he was pretty early on creating the sense that we as a group were kind of exalted or special, that we had some kind of, he didn't say what it was initially, but if we worked together and followed his program, we'd be able to sort of achieve great things and essentially like save the world. So that, and I think as a college student, but also as anyone at any age, you want to be doing something important, right? Plus, early I was watching him first with my friends, kind of separate them from their families, from their support network. He was convincing folks that their parents had abused them as children. And for me, I watched my friend, I'd never seen anything like this before, but they were having conversations in front of me. And over time, I'd see Isabella say that her parents had in fact abused her and she hadn't remembered this. And this is at the end of hours and hours and hours of conversation. And when you're just watching that and you have no exposure to this kind of thing, why would you question that what your friend is saying isn't true? It seemed true. And so all of these sort of these early things, I mean, not to mention just that there was a man in his 50s living in a college dorm, if you want to go there. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely a red flag. One of the things that stuck out to me, and it's hard for us not to make comparisons between Larry Ray and Keith Raniere, but I don't know if you know this, but Keith also had nicknames for people. And when he named you Daniel without the I thought that was a pretty interesting metaphor. And I wondered what you've come to terms with in regards to that since leaving.
Yeah, it's amazing the various subtle ways that one person can control another person. We think about the really extreme ones, but a nickname is power. Getting to decide what you call someone. Yeah, he would call me Daniel which is weird. And it's not something anyone else has ever called me or would call me.
Well, it's not affectionate.
No, it was sort of pejorative.
Normally, nicknames have kind of an affectionate kind of a relationship to your personality, and oftentimes a nod to how they like you.
Yeah.
Right? Daniel doesn't have that ring.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was kind of everything, that in a lot of ways signified our dynamic, which is that, it was a means of control. It felt to me like it somehow simultaneously had this soft edge of being like, I care for you, I guess, because he was giving me, at a certain point, just to have any kind of attention felt good because of this kind of addiction to a person. But also, it always sounded like he was calling me like, you idiot, so all of it wrapped up together makes you very confused and really just this desire to just be good or to look good in his eyes or to somehow just fix the situation. That was the power he had.
Interesting.
This is the golden age of cult recovery. The more we speak up and share our stories, the more we realize we are not alone. Your voice and your story can empower others. This is Sarah, and I'm proud to be a founding collaborator of the #IGotOut movement. Learn more at igotout.org.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or never miss yoga. Maybe it's getting 8 hours of sleep. I mean, that's my personal and everyone's dream, isn't it? Well, I definitely have some non-negotiables. Like, I'm in Vancouver right now, and I'm spending literally as much time as I can outside in nature. #cold pools, #crushing it. Nature is a non-negotiable. Not enough time in the fresh air and the trees around me, and I start to feel not great, not myself, not grounded. Therapy day is a bit like my nature walks. I try to not miss it, and I know I'm just going to feel so much better all around if I make it a priority. I get so much out of it. It helps me put my worries and anxieties in their rightful place and helps me clear my mind so I can focus on what I really need and sometimes what I don't need. Like, I don't need to be overbooking myself just because I hate to say no to people. You know what I mean? Thanks, therapy. Thanks for helping me see that. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Look, even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/culty today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/culty.
I want to ask on the heels of Zach, the question I asked him. One of the things that I found out in interviewing Zach is that you went to him with the idea of covering this and with the sentiment of wanting to own your own story and recognizing the importance of that, and then being sensitive to everyone else's and not telling theirs, which I related to with, how I wanted to tell my story. I didn't want anyone else to tell it, and I didn't want that thing. So, but he ended up growing into what became the documentary. Can you tell me about that process, why it was important to you, and why it was so vital that you do it in that way?
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for asking that. What Larry did was make me and my friends question our memory of what had actually happened, not just before we met him in our past, but also while we were there. It was so hard to hold on to anything. And he took away our control, from, as big as our whole lives and our futures, and as small as like getting to decide when you go to the bathroom. And he, in a lot of ways, kind of took the stories that everyone tells themselves about who they are and what their lives are, and he rewrote them and made us tell them his way. And so, when I got out, and I lived with this as a secret for many years, and that's its own story, what that does to you. And then I got contacted by at the time, a freelance reporter. He had been a Sarah Lawrence student, and he had heard a story that my friend, who had also gone to Sarah Lawrence, had been poisoning people. And this was because Larry published a website with her name, with all these false confessions that he had extracted from her, all this stuff saying that she was poisoning people. And so this was the first time after 6 years of being out that I learned that it was still happening. I just hoped when I left that it would fall apart. It didn't seem sustainable. And I dreamed of going back and saving my friends and knew that that was impossible to do safely for anyone. And so, when this reporter said, I heard your friend has been poisoning people, it felt like it was an imperative, starting then to set the record straight, to protect everyone, because I couldn't let Larry's narrative about her life be what was the record, So I said, I have to tell you a lot of things, And so I let them use my name for this story that ended up going into New York Magazine because I wanted it to be credible. And it became this kind of battle of credibility because Larry was still out there. There was no investigation happening. My friends were still with him. And I still had the sound of the camera shutter when he took a photo of me while he was, had put me in a dress and was making me like swallow a dildo in my brain, right? So these things were terrifying, but it felt like it's easy to make the decision to kind of take that risk when it means like trying to protect a bunch of people you care about. And then after that story came out, there was immense media interest, and it became really clear, it was made very clear to me that other people were more than willing to tell the story without any survivor involvement at all or with superficial involvement. And still, I was essentially the only one out. And I felt like to make it possible for my friends to leave without having to make that decision, leaving into a world that didn't understand them, that saw them as like participants in a kind of horror movie, I had to make sure that the story was told accurately and compassionately. And it basically took on writing a book in like 9 months and getting it published and doing the whole thing just to try to reclaim the right to what had happened. And then brought a couple of chapters of that to Zach, and we sat down and talked about it. And he shared my ethos about, wanting to do this in a way that was careful and that protected the victims. And he wanted to expand the amount of empathy that viewers might feel for people like us. And that's all that I wanted. And he didn't want to make something that was like classic true crime, scary music and titillating, whatever. So,
And he did that.
He did that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did.
I mean, in the process of making this documentary, this investigation started. Larry got arrested. My friends started coming out. After the conviction, I was able to speak with them for the first time in like a decade.
What was that like?
It's so hard to evoke what it's like. I mean, as I think like you grieve people that you think you're never going to be able to talk to again. And there's all these points in an experience like this where, you think you're supposed to feel a certain way. And when you don't, it's confusing. When my friends came back, I felt fear because I had learned to fear them. We learned to fear each other because we were all played off of one another in this abusive environment. But mostly it was just disorienting because it felt like talking to ghosts. It was like you died, and here you are. Over time, getting to this place where like the moment when they watched the documentary for the first time, which I had been making so many choices that felt like life or death about making the documentary and how it was made and what Zach should and shouldn't do. And when they watched it and felt good about it, like I cannot tell you how that felt. And then when Larry was sentenced and watching Santos and Felicia and Yali like hug and cry and be safe finally after years of just trying to get here.
I had a question that I don't think was answered anywhere. Like when you went to England, I was like, oh, for sure that separation will be enough and he'll snap out of it, but it wasn't. And I'm wondering now that you're out, like, what do you think was the force that was it just the strength of Larry, or you just wasn't bad enough yet? Or what do you think it was that kept you in, even though you had this a year away from him?
Yeah, there's something really valuable in people seeing that even when I left this apartment, this like insulated, abusive environment, and traveled across the ocean and was in England at school, that still I was in it, and I think that it was a combination of things. It was fear, right? I mean, that's what like thought control is. It felt like he would know if I thought bad things about him or wanted to leave. I knew that eventually I was going to have to come back. I was going to have to come back to school and to the US, and I was going to have to see everyone. And I didn't know how to avoid encountering them, and I was going to have to reckon with that. I think that a lot of the most extreme physical abuse for me started after I got back. So it was bad, but not so bad that like the survival instinct had kicked all the way in. And it's isolating to study abroad. I made friends, but in a lot of ways felt alone. And then having had this experience was even more isolating. I didn't tell anyone at all what my life had been like, right before I got on the plane.
Wow. Well, your waking up and escaping was very profound. And one little detail that's not in the documentary that's in your book is that on the way out, you grabbed a bedside table that somebody was getting rid of in the foyer. What does that bedside table represent, and do you still have it?
Yeah. Still got that
Great
table.
question.
Gonna always have that table. Yeah, there was this bedside table that someone was getting rid of in the lobby of the building where I had lived with Larry and everyone else. And they were getting rid of it, I guess. I hope they were getting rid of it.
I hope so too. Otherwise, you're a thief.
No, I think they were getting rid of it. Yeah. And so I grabbed this table and carried it with me all the way to the subway and on the train, up to school. And that table has stayed with me everywhere I've lived since, all the way across the country now to Los Angeles.
Good.
It represents that moment of me choosing me, of me like believing something inside of myself just for an instant to say like, I don't care, what's true or what's false. If this guy is a good guy or a bad guy, I don't know. And for the first time, I'm okay with not knowing. I just want to feel okay for like 1 second, and I know that I feel that way if I'm away. And also like I get to have something that's mine, and from that table, the rest of my life has expanded.
I love it. I love the meaningfulness of that table.
Well, I also love once you bet on yourself, and this is something that I think Sarah and I have experienced. Once you bet on yourself, the world does open up and the people show up.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've experienced that.
It's true.
And the good ones, right? It's been a real blessing to just go make that pivot. And then through no real conscience thing, you don't have the shackles on you anymore. It's your light that's out there now. And as a result of that, the support will come.
Yeah.
And look at what you've done. I mean, from that moment, how many years is that?
So it's been about a decade since then, maybe almost 11 years now. Yeah. And I mean, the biggest accomplishment of my life in a lot of ways is it's hard because they was helping to create the circumstances that made it more possible for my friends to make themselves safe and to be able to do that for themselves.
I think that's an amazing accomplishment.
Thank you. Yeah. I feel pretty good about it. Yeah. And that thing that you're developing, when you're 18 and 19, but that honestly you're like working on your whole life is that compass where, you trust yourself and you decide which way you want to point yourself and what you care about. And it's that Larry and abusers like this try to take the place of that compass, right? Like everything ran through him, every decision, every thought. So getting to like be back in charge and to listen to myself and writing the book and talking to you now is really every time for me, it's about stating that what I saw, what I remember is true. My witness account matters, it matters. And I believe myself.
So important and profound. And it really is the antidote to everything. It's funny that you said that about the compass, because I'd always said that he dismantled our compass, which I think is true, but I hadn't had that piece about like replaced it. and became the compass. And I think that that's such a huge part of the healing journey, is to rebuild it. And, telling the story, and especially for you, like so many times during your book, I was like, wow, I don't know how you feel about the word bravery, but it's like, it's a mixed feeling for me. But there is certainly, I will say for you, that there's so much bravery in saying these, what would be perceived as shameful, experiences. Like most people don't talk about it because of the shame.
Yeah. And, shame is the darkness in which people like this are able to operate. And a big part of my healing has just been like embracing every part of myself, including like, I'm fine with the word bravery because I love compliments and validation, because I'm insecure like everyone, like
You're
I'm
human.
a person and I think being messy. Yeah. Like part of what made me vulnerable to this was I wanted so badly to be good and to not have anything wrong with me. And it's just like, we have to be okay with being kind of sloppy or not perfect, and like, and not knowing the answers. And like, it's just all, part of the joy of living.
Can you listen to Bill Withers to this day or no?
Yeah. One of the many like oddly self-aware things that Larry said to me when it was clear that I was going to like leave, but I don't know if he knew that I was going to leave forever. I had gotten housing on campus. It was like I was sort of graduating in a way. He said, how are you going to listen to any of these songs again? He had made this playlist that he played every morning, the same order, and Lovely Day by Bill Withers was on it. And what a horrible thing to wake up to every morning in an abusive cult. Horrible irony.
That's what I was telling
That's
Sarah.
cruel.
I was like, that song to me would drive me up the wall. That's when I knew Larry Ray was bad.
That's how you know. That's how you can tell.
That Bill Withers shit doesn't fly. Shit.
But can you listen to any of that music or no?
Yeah, like it's totally. I had a friend who's just reading my book, and we were out somewhere, and that song came on, and he turned to me. He was like, "Oh, that song's in your book." And I was like, "Yeah, I know. It sure is." And it's fine. It's fine. I think the reality
Good for you.
in like,
Good for you.
yeah, in sort of individuating and identity forming since then, like I love my music tastes. I love music, and it feels good to be like, yeah, those songs are fine, but they're not really like for me. I just think like Larry's music taste was kind of like boring and not that great. Just kind of like a very New Jersey classic rock radio station.
That makes total sense.
Hey there, listener. Hope you're enjoying this episode and that you're remembering to hydrate, stretch, and unclench your jaws. Sometimes listening to conversations about heavy topics can really make you tighten up, And remember, a little bit culty loves you. Also, come hang out with us on Patreon after you finish this episode. It's fun over there. Fun is good. And now, here's a brief message from our sponsors.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or never miss yoga. Maybe it's getting 8 hours of sleep. I mean, that's my personal and everyone's dream, isn't it? Well, I definitely have some non-negotiables. Like, I'm in Vancouver right now, and I'm spending literally as much time as I can outside in nature. Hashtag cold pools, hashtag crushing it. Nature is a non-negotiable. Not enough time in the fresh air and the trees around me, and I start to feel not great, not myself, not grounded. Therapy day is a bit like my nature walks. I try to not miss it, and I know I'm just going to feel so much better all around if I make it a priority. I get so much out of it. It helps me put my worries and anxieties in their rightful place and helps me clear my mind so I can focus on what I really need and sometimes what I don't need. Like, I don't need to be overbooking myself just because I hate to say no to people. You know what I mean? Thanks, therapy. Thanks for helping me see that. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Look, even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever.
Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/culty today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/culty.
On that note, also, is there anything, and this is like also part of me and Nippy's journey, trying to figure out like what was good, what was bad. Obviously, Larry stole from a lot of different places. Is there anything that you're able to distill and still apply in your life, or did you just check it all out and kind of start fresh?
Yeah, I went to it was Dan Shaw's support group for survivors of cults and family members.
Oh, good. I'm so glad you found that.
That was like right after I started thinking of it as a cult. And one of the really useful things that I heard there that felt like seeing myself was someone said, part of what's so confusing about an experience like this is that there are elements of it that even afterwards feel like they were good or useful. And you want to just say it was all bad so you can like get rid of it. But how do you deal with these things? And they were saying you can kind of choose what you take with you. And I think that's sort of true. My feeling is it's important to recognize that you wouldn't get pulled into it in the first place if there was nothing good or appealing about it, right? It's not like whole cloth bad. It's been funny to look back on it and be like, what, like Larry taught me how to make good pasta sauce. Like, is that worth it?
Yeah.
And was he even right about like, I could just like Google a recipe, yeah, I think, and a lot of the things that for a long time I thought were helping me or were good were in fact part of what made me keep it a secret or not process it. Like he was all about stoicism, Marcus Aurelius, like, you don't feel your feelings. And what happened is like, you decide if it's good or bad, but it's just sort of a fact. And so it was all these things that I thought were good at first, I think really turned out to kind of all be pretty bad. And a lot of the ways that I thought I developed because of him, I think I really developed in spite of him.
Yes. I do think it's ironic that, or poetic justice or something, that one of the things he did teach you, the first piece of advice he gave you about your ex-girlfriend was that you could just walk away. And that was the piece of advice that you took to make your exit. So,
Good
yeah.
call. I'm so glad you noticed that.
I did notice that. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely thought about that afterwards, that I used Larry's first piece of advice to leave him, Yeah, and that was, I really thought about it. I was like, he said that I could not answer phone calls and texts and that you're allowed to do that and you don't have to feel like you're a bad person, And so I was breaking up with him.
Yeah.
We broke up.
Yeah.
He was a bad boyfriend. Very bad.
He was a bad. Yeah.
I'm so
really
glad
one
you
of the bad
dumped
ones,
him on his white, tidy, whitey ass.
Me too.
Go ahead, Nippy. Sorry, to wrap that up.
Mine was more of his tactics. Did he get you to disassociate from your body, your feelings and stuff like that and get you to live more intellectually?
Yeah, I haven't gotten to talk about this very much. And maybe because I don't know quite how to articulate it. So Larry was all about the mind and about logic. One of the things he would point out is when you start a sentence with, I think, like, I think that this is blah, 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 or I feel like, and anytime that you would say like, I feel, and you start to notice this when someone points out this kind of thing, and then you're like analyzing everything you say. But he would say that, the language you're using reveals that you're coming from an emotional place rather than like just a intellectual place, and therefore it's unreliable. And this focus on like the intellect and intellectualism seems to me like a very toxic, classic masculine thing, like a masculinity thing. Like feelings are in no way legitimized. And so a big part of me leaving was trying to be like, maybe I don't need to just deny these feelings. I don't have to have language for them or have answers to like where they're coming from or what they mean, but I feel this way and I'm just going to lean into that feeling over having to like work out the maze of Larry's logic and what's true and what's false. Because, once you start with a false premise, you can build this like house of cards, and it's really hard to get away from it.
One of the things that we've been noticing consistently amongst these people is the overemphasis on the intellect and the logical framework as a basis for making decisions, as opposed to how you think and feel about things, is dangerous. And it's an easier domain for people to be controlled because you're using words and you're influencing them there. Sarah and I were talking about it at a dinner last week, how it's consistently going on even in schooling and stuff like that, like the intellect and that stuff is, that's our standardized testing as opposed to thinking and feeling more. And I'm not going to get into my theories of it because
Separate podcast.
that's a separate
You're getting cut
podcast.
off. You're getting cut off from your feelings, and that's where you feel your morality.
That's your humanity.
In your humanity. Yes.
Yeah.
That's where you're experiencing it in your thoughts and your feelings. That is your humanity.
I agree. It's really hard for me to account for, why I left earlier than everyone else. And I think that a big part of that is I grew up in a family that was like that. My dad is a good guy and they mean well, but there was no talking about feelings in a way that is very, typical, I think. And so I started writing poetry, from a really young age. And for me, poetry was this way to feel my feelings, to talk about my feelings kind of with myself. And while I was in the cult and everything was going on around me, I still was writing poems, even as Larry was trying to sort of choke off that feeling part of me. I think that being able to write the whole time was this kind of lifeline to that part of my brain that he was trying to completely remove. And, and so for me, there's also a kind of poetic irony in like the way that I took him down was through writing, right?
Well, I would say also through love and light. That stuff lives there, and your love and light lives in your body, and that's where you come from. And if he's trying to cut you off from that, and he may have made you stronger.
I actually had it as my last point. I'll say it now because you just brought it up. Yeah, the poetic justice / irony of you maintaining yourself and being able to express yourself with feelings, with words, with metaphors, with meaning, and to be successful at it. To be successful, and then also from there go to to participate in the documentary, all of it. But specifically for me as another survivor, it's like a big fuck you. Big fuck you. I'm going to get out. I'm going to be successful, and I'm going to share my story and prevent other people from falling into the grips of douchebags like you, Mr. Larry Ray, if that's your real name anyway. No, it's not. You fucking con man. Excuse me. I can say this for you. I just think that's great. And I encourage all our listeners to buy the book and to support the book, because that is the biggest thing we can do to support you, as you continue on your journey, to know that you have all these listeners who want to support you and see you thrive because somebody took time out of their life to try to thwart that. So we get to do the opposite.
Thank you. That's really nice. Yeah. I mean, I think that what's been really remarkable to me about the two of you, about everyone that I've met through the recovery community, is that a big part of the healing process for a lot of people, it doesn't have to be, but for a lot of people, it seems to be helping other people. It's pretty hard for me to think about, what helps me, but it feels really easy to direct that care towards other people who need it, and to think about, the families that I talk to who have kids who are either inside of a similar abusive situation or trying to figure out how to process the afterward, or, all of the people out there who have had similar experiences and maybe are either in it or in that period of time that I was in for so long where I didn't know what to call it. And I didn't know if there was anyone else who would see me. And, I see you.
Wow.
Well, we'll all take care of each other. How about that?
Yeah. Let's do that.
Speaking of being in that space where you didn't know what to call it, one of the things, the metaphors that stuck out for me towards the end of the book, where you learned about cults. And I'm going to butcher your exact words, but it was something about that your brain had been separated in two, and then understanding the word cult was a bridge to bring your brain back together. And I just thought that was such a profound chunk. We talked about this last night over Instagram. Do you feel comfortable reading that last little bit? You have it?
This is what happened. Was I had been emailing with someone at the time. I kind of couldn't remember how I had come across this or what had happened. And it drove me crazy while I was writing the book that, of all things, I couldn't find what was this list or who. And I think whoever it was that I'd been emailing with sent me or pointed me to Robert Lifton's list of criteria. I'm pretty sure that's what it was.
The 16 characteristics?
Yeah.
I think so.
That's in Jan Jelowic's book.
Yeah. There's a lot of places. Yeah.
Yeah. I've cut and pasted and sent that to a lot of people.
They really appreciated that.
It's pretty amazing.
It's really useful. I tried to recreate it from memory. Okay. It's this one paragraph that I think you're referring to.
Yeah. Please read it.
I had been in a cult, not just living in an apartment with my friend's dad, not some weird relationship with Isabella, not just hanging out with my friends, everything going constantly awry, and us never able to catch up, to fix it all. Not broken, suicidal, needing to be saved. I was shaky and raw, stranded on top of the blanketless bed. I felt like I had just returned from many years living on a planet with different gravity, like my bones were thinned out entirely. It wasn't a surprise exactly, but it wasn't quite like I had known it all along either. It was like the two sides of my brain had been separated, and the word was a bridge that put them back together. My dad had said it so early on, I remembered now, but the saying had been made impossible, unallowable. It was as if I'd been experiencing a unique kind of pain, but I'd forgotten what pain was, so I didn't know how to tell anyone what was wrong. But here it was. Other people had been through this, had felt it, knew what it was called.
Isn't that so good, Nippy?
Wow. That's pretty amazing.
The part about the bones too and the gravity, it's like for those listeners who have been through similar things, it's just such a knowing. And for those who haven't, that's what it feels like when you figure out you're in a cult.
It's a death scare. I call those death scares.
Mm-hmm.
Viscerally, it's a death scare. It's like hitting turbulence, except you're in turbulence, like, and it stays. You know that shaky feeling, but then it stays.
Yeah.
It's there at like 2 a.m. when you wake up. It's just there until it's not. And then you kind of go, okay.
Did you have any PTSD after?
Yeah. I did.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Like when I first tried to talk to a therapist about it, I thought, I'll just tell the whole thing, and then we can just kind of move forward. And that was the beginning of knowing I couldn't. It was so hard to talk about. My throat closed up. My whole body was shaking. I was like sweating and watching this person, her jaw slowly getting closer to the floor. And it's been a long process through really great therapists and multiple therapists and having like reconnecting with all the people in my life and kind of putting things back together. And I think that part, like helping my friends, has had a significant effect on my ability to feel stable, but getting to a place where I can talk about it like this and I'm not like about to throw up is really cool. Yeah.
I did hear an interview with you early on that I noted that you didn't sound ready to.
Yeah.
Not that it was a bad interview, but that you were still in trauma.
Yeah.
And no judgment. We did tons of interviews in deep trauma. So it's like.
Which I don't recommend.
I don't recommend, no.
They don't age well.
Yeah. I mean, it's lucky, like with the documentary, I had Zach picking and choosing because I think I sat in that chair in front of the camera for probably dozens and dozens of hours, and what's actually in the documentary isn't all that much. And kind of like, thank God.
I keep meaning to ask, like, how was it for you to watch the doc now? Was it cathartic, hard?
Yeah.
Or all of it?
So many people experience abuse and all they have to go on is that feeling that I was talking about of like, I believe myself, which is empowering, but really hard. And then I got to have first some journalists, and then the FBI, and then this documentarian doing all the work of corroborating my story. This FBI agent went through every line of my book and tied it to a piece of like video evidence or something that another survivor had said. So getting that is an unbelievable privilege, to go from being alone and in isolation and just hoping someone would believe me to being told again and again, this is true, look, and then to watch the documentary. It's hard, definitely, to see that footage of, there's footage that Larry took in the documentary of the abuse happening. And one of the most disorienting things is that his whole abusive program was predicated on memory not being reliable. And then I watch video of me, being hit with a hammer, and I have zero memory of that happening, and I sat in a room full of lawyers and FBI agents, and they showed me this, and I had to, in front of those people, I don't, that is me. Yes. So that's a strange thing to go through.
Wow.
I bet. I had more questions. I'm going to rapid fire, okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. That's
And just
fine.
pay pass if you don't want to talk about it. So have you had a chance to kumbaya or reconnect with Raven and Max? Or do you feel comfortable saying?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I've gotten to reconnect with like everyone that I lived with everyone I
good.
lived with at
That's
Slonim.
great.
Raven and I talk often. She's incredible. And I think that comes through in the documentary. We're
Yes.
trying to work on a children's book together.
Oh,
Oh, that's awesome.
did Talia and Isabella wake up? Or is anyone still in?
Isabella just submitted court documents like last
Right.
week saying that she sees herself as another victim of Larry, which is a
Got it.
big change.
That's a big shift.
My audience for all of this was always like the people who are still in, and I hope that seeing the documentary might do something. And so, yeah, the process of getting out has been really paired with making these things. And I hope that Isabella's on her way. As far as Talia, I can't really say. You know, she's been Larry's victim
don't know.
since she was born. So I don't
Yeah.
know where she's at.
Did you see her at the trial? Because you testified, right?
I did all the trial prep and was lined up to testify. And then Larry had a bunch of supposed seizures and they cut 10 witnesses at the end of the trial. So I didn't get to testify, but I did get to give a victim impact statement and get to speak while Larry sat silently, which I did not get to do for a long time. Yeah.
That's great.
Can we end on that moment?
Yeah.
Can we end this and just keep tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, like the way that I express myself is in writing, and I got to write down everything that I felt and my truth, you know, and I got to walk up there in the room with this human being, this man who I hadn't been in the room with for a decade, and to stand there and say my piece, you know, while he had to listen, which I didn't get to do the whole time I knew him. And that was an incredibly powerful moment.
I am so proud of you. Obviously, we'll get everyone to read the book and watch the doc. And I'm going to send you a song by somebody from the hashtag I Got Out movement. And it's called It's Your Turn to Listen. And after this episode, I just want you to just listen to it. And I have a feeling you'll have a big cry like I did the first time I listened to it. And I hope it helps you in your healing journey, and just stunned by your willingness to put yourself out there, truly.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
It's a gift.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, both of you, for everything you do so much.
I love Dan's book, and I love the doc too. I think they're a great companion piece. Highly recommend both.
The thing I like most about he has the hindsight of having some years away to think and approach the subject in a very sensitive way, in ways that we couldn't, is that he was extremely sensitive, I think, to telling his story and then allowing space for everyone else in there to tell their story. Ours was, we have to get out and burn it down. And it was a lot of self-preservation, and we didn't know we were looking at it. We didn't know what happened. He's had time to reflect on that and then and approach it where he could be sensitive to those things in a way that we couldn't at that time. We were being thrown into litigation. So there's two different ways these things go oftentimes, right? Like you're covering people in real time. They don't know what they're looking at. It's going to be messy no matter what, right? And you might not approve of how they do it, right? And what are we supposed to do? Check in with the cult leaving gods about how we're supposed to leave it? Or, you know, and we were dragged into the fight. Or it's you leave, you go back, you reconcile your delusion on your own, and then you can re-enter the conversation sensitive to everyone's perspective as much as you can, right? Without being clumsy about it.
It's a gift. It's a gift to have all these different documentaries that tackle this very sensitive subject in all sorts of different ways, giving victims and survivors all sorts of templates and playbooks depending on what their personal needs are, both legally, emotionally, financially, and depending on the nature of the group, or in this case, the man, Larry Ray, whose real name is Lawrence Greco, by the way.
Kudos to Daniel and how he's handled it and how he's emerged and how he's turned it into a positive.
Yes. He actually brought this story to Zach, the director we interview next week. And I love their camaraderie and their friendship, and how Zach created a safe place through that trust for not only Dan to tell his story, but the other victims of Larry Ray. So stay tuned for next week. Make sure to follow us in all the places, blah, blah, blah. You know the drill. In the interim, if you have questions for Daniel and you're on Patreon or want to join us over on Patreon, we will be doing a live stream this coming Wednesday on Zoom. So we'll be able to see each other, ask questions, and process the emotional overload that is dealing with this whole topic. So we thank Daniel in advance for that. Please do join us there. Again, that's 8:30 p.m. Eastern on Zoom, and the link will be on Patreon for the Flying Monkeys and the Inner Circle. Yes, that is tongue-in-cheek. I hope that you all know that. Again, thank you for joining us. See you there.
Look forward to it.
Thanks for watching. Bye
Bye.
for now.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean. I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Hope you like this episode. Let's keep the conversation going and come hang out with us on Patreon, where we keep the tape rolling each week with special episodes just for Patreon subscribers and where we get deep into the weeds of unpacking every episode of The Vow.
And if you're looking for our show notes or some sweet, sweet swag or official ALBC podcast merch or a list of our most recommended cult recovery resources, visit our website at alittlebitculty.com.
And for more background on what brought us here, check out Sarah's page-turning memoir. It's called Scarred, the true story of how I escaped Nexium, the cult that bound my life. It's available on Amazon, Audible, narrated by my wife, and at most bookstores.
A Little Bit Culty is a Talkhouse podcast and a Trace 120 production. We're executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, with writing, research, and additional production support by senior producer Jess Tardy. We're edited, mixed, and mastered by our rocking producer Will Rutherford of Citizens of Sound, and our amazing theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant and co-written by Nigel Asselin. Thank you for listening.
So have you
Exactly.
ever done a show in PVC?
Yeah, man. I did a tour in PVC and I regret it a little bit. I do, man. I regret it a little bit. So it's just like, it wasn't very flattering on the top and then my knob was showing the whole time.
Moving right along.
Anyway, moving along.
Mum's like, I don't want to talk about your knob.
I don't want to talk about your
Not right now.
Not right now. We'll do it after the cameras are off.
So yes, you will.
Billboard chart-topping singer and songwriter Youngblood joins the Osbournes podcast. Listen now wherever you get podcasts